What you're about to hear is not a theory, not speculation, but a sequence of observations that, taken together, challenge everything we understand about how the universe behaves. It is April 2nd, 2026, and just 6 hours ago, the James Webb Space Telescope transmitted an image that forced an entire control room into silence. Not confusion, silence. Because sometimes the data doesn't just surprise you, it contradicts reality. I want you to picture Jupiter, more specifically its most iconic feature, the Great Red Spot, a massive, centuries-old storm system larger than Earth, powered by immense gravity, deep atmospheric layers, and extreme pressure. It exists because Jupiter is a gas giant with thousands of kilometers of dense atmosphere. That storm is not just weather, it is physics in action. Now replace Jupiter with an object called 3I Atlas. This is not a planet, it is a comet, a frozen remnant, roughly 4 kilometers wide, drifting through the near vacuum of space. No atmosphere, no pressure layers, no internal heat engine capable of sustaining anything remotely similar to weather. By every model we have, it should be inert, just releasing gas and dust as it warms near the Sunday. But as of 4 UTC this morning, 3I Atlas is doing something that should not be possible. It is displaying a rotating crimson vortex on its surface. Not a loose cloud, not random turbulence. A structured, mathematically precise vortex, visually and dynamically identical to Jupiter's Great Red Spot, scaled down but proportionally exact. A storm on an object that cannot support storms. Take a moment and think about that. The probability of a chaotic cometary coma organizing itself into a stable, rotating system that perfectly mirrors a planetary storm has been calculated. The result is approximately 1 in 4.8 trillion. In physics, numbers like that are not called unlikely. They are called impossible. When the initial data arrived from the JWST's NIRCam instrument, the first assumption was error, sensor noise, calibration drift, something in the pipeline. Because a comet cannot generate a weather system, it lacks every required condition. No gravity well to hold gases, no thermal gradients to drive circulation, no atmospheric layers to sustain pressure differences. But then, the confirmation came. The Gaia spacecraft independently observed the same structure, same coordinates, same rotational behavior. A coherent, red-shifted vortex embedded in the coma of a comet. 2 different instruments, 2 different methods, 1 identical conclusion. What we are looking at is a frozen object organizing its surrounding gas into a high-pressure storm system that mirrors one of the most complex atmospheric phenomena in our solar system. And the precision is what makes this truly unsettling. The rotational velocity at the outer edge of this microvortex was measured at 430 kilometers per hour. Not an estimate, an exact proportional match to the rotational dynamics of Jupiter's storm when scaled by size. This is not turbulence. Turbulence is chaotic, unpredictable, unstable. This is controlled. Even more concerning is how suddenly it appeared. Less than 24 hours ago, 3I Atlas showed no such behavior. It was behaving exactly as expected. Now, it is effectively wearing the signature of a gas giant. So the question becomes unavoidable. Why would a 4-kilometer comet replicate a 14,000-kilometer planetary storm? What system could possibly generate the energy required to sustain such a vortex in deep space? And perhaps most importantly, what mechanism could produce something this precise, this structured, this intentional? Because based on data that has not yet been publicly released, this storm is not just sitting on the surface, it is being driven from beneath. And to understand why that detail changes everything, we need to step back and examine what a comet is supposed to be and why 3I Atlas is breaking every rule we have ever written. Stay with me, because what comes next is where the anomaly becomes a pattern, and patterns are never accidental. If you want to understand why this discovery is shaking the foundations of astrophysics, you first need to understand something very simple. Comets are not supposed to organize anything. They are chaotic by nature. They are leftovers from the birth of the solar system, cold, irregular bodies made of ice, dust, and rock. When they approach the sun, they heat up, and that heat causes gases to escape. This process is called outgassing, and it creates a surrounding cloud known as a coma. That coma is messy. It expands outward in all directions, shaped loosely by solar radiation and weak gravitational effects. It does not form patterns, it does not stabilize, and it definitely does not create something as complex as a storm system. But 3I Atlas is not behaving like any comet we have ever studied. The shift from unusual to completely unexplainable began on February 14th, just days ago. The first alert came from the Atacama Large Millimeter, Sub-Millimeter Array in northern Chile. Its highly sensitive receivers detected carbon monoxide gas being emitted from the object, but instead of expanding outward like a normal coma, the gas was rotating, not drifting, rotating. The motion was measured at 430 kilometers per hour, forming a tight, counterclockwise circle centered precisely on the comet's nucleus. At first glance, there was a possible explanation. If the nucleus itself were spinning rapidly, it could drag surrounding gas along with it. That's rare, but not impossible. But then the second dataset arrived, and that explanation collapsed. The James Webb Space Telescope focused its spectroscopic instruments on the same region. What it detected was not just motion, but structure. There was a clear temperature gradient within the vortex. The center was significantly colder, by about 120 Kelvin, than the outer edges. Pause and think about what that means. A cold core, surrounded by a warmer, faster-moving boundary, forming a distinct pressure wall. That is not random gas behavior. That is the exact thermal signature of an anticyclonic storm, the same type of system seen in Jupiter's Great Red Spot. And then came the third confirmation. The Hubble Space Telescope captured the visual spectrum. The structure was no longer just a motion pattern or a temperature anomaly, it had color. A deep, rusty red tone, almost identical to the ochre coloration of Jupiter's storm system. Now look at what we have. ALMA measured the velocity and rotational dynamics. JWST confirmed the internal thermal structure. Hubble verified the visual composition and coloration. Three completely independent systems, using different methods, all pointing to the same conclusion. This is not coincidence. This is convergence. We are observing a storm system mathematically and physically equivalent to a planetary vortex existing on an object that cannot support such a system. And that's where the real problem begins. To create a structure like the Great Red Spot, you need layers of gas moving at different speeds. You need shear forces. You need sustained pressure and gravity to keep everything bound together. On Jupiter, those conditions exist naturally because of its massive size and composition. 3I Atlas has none of those things. Its environment is almost a vacuum. The gases it releases should disperse instantly. They should not stay together long enough to form organized motion, let alone stabilize into a coherent system. But instead of dissipating, the structure is becoming more refined. And over the last 48 hours, a sequence of additional anomalies has emerged, each one more difficult to explain than the last. The first major shift occurred at 14 UTC yesterday. The previously irregular edges of the vortex suddenly smoothed out. The structure became geometrically stable, forming a perfect ellipse. The ratio between its long axis and short axis was measured at 1.6 to 1. That number is not arbitrary. It is the exact aspect ratio of Jupiter's Great Red Spot. 6 hours later, a second anomaly appeared. Scientists detected shear zones, bands of gas moving in opposite directions along the outer edges of the vortex. On Jupiter, These are known as atmospheric jets or trade winds, driven by internal heat and planetary rotation. But on a 4-kilometer comet, there is no internal heat source capable of driving such motion. And then came the third anomaly, the one that changes everything. The storm began to pulse, not randomly, not chaotically, but rhythmically, expanding and contracting in a steady cycle every 4 hours and 55 minutes. This is not turbulence. This is periodic behavior, consistent, measurable, and repeatable. At this point, one question becomes unavoidable. A storm requires energy, a lot of it. On Jupiter, that energy comes from gravitational compression and solar input. But 3I Atlas is too small, too cold, and too distant from the Sun to generate anything close to this level of activity. So, where is the energy coming from? Because whatever is powering this system is not only sustaining it, it is controlling it. And to understand just how far this situation has moved beyond known physics, we need to look at the raw mechanics behind it. Because when we do, we discover that the numbers themselves are starting to break. Stay with me, because in the next part, the equations stop making sense, and that is where things get truly serious. If the visual evidence wasn't enough to raise concern, what comes next removes any remaining doubt. Because when scientists stopped looking at images and started looking at the numbers, the situation didn't just become strange, it became physically impossible. To understand why, we need to look at one of the most fundamental tools in fluid dynamics, the Reynolds number. This is a dimensionless value used to predict how fluids behave. In simple terms, it tells us whether a system will be smooth and stable or chaotic and turbulent. Low Reynolds numbers mean particles move independently with little interaction. High Reynolds numbers mean dense, energetic systems capable of forming large, stable structures like vortices. On Jupiter, the Reynolds number inside the Great Red Spot is enormous billions. That's why the storm has persisted for centuries. The atmosphere is thick, the pressure is high, and the energy driving it is immense. Now compare that to a comet like 3I Atlas. In the near vacuum of space, with extremely low particle density, the Reynolds number should be close to zero. Gas molecules are too far apart to interact meaningfully. They don't swirl. They don't form pressure systems. They simply drift away into space. But late last night, the measured Reynolds number for the vortex on 3I Atlas came in at 4.2 million. Let that sink in. That number implies a level of density and internal interaction that simply cannot exist in a cometary coma. It suggests the gas is behaving less like a dispersed cloud and more like a cohesive fluid, almost like a liquid ocean suspended in space. This is where the standard model breaks completely. Think of it like this. If you stir a cup of coffee, you create a vortex. But the moment you stop stirring, friction takes over and the motion fades. The system loses energy and returns to stillness. On Jupiter, the Great Red Spot continues because the planet itself constantly stirs the atmosphere through internal heat and rotation. But 3I Atlas has no such mechanism. It is not supposed to have an energy source. It is not supposed to maintain motion. And yet, the vortex is not weakening, it is becoming more defined. So the question becomes unavoidable. If the system is being sustained, then something is actively supplying energy. And then, early this morning at exactly 8:15 UTC, something changed that made this situation even more difficult to explain. The Hubble Space Telescope, using its cosmic origin spectrograph, detected a sudden spike in ultraviolet radiation coming directly from the center of the storm. This was not part of any prediction model. There was no expected mechanism that could generate such a signal. But the most important detail was not the spike itself. It was the pattern. The ultraviolet emission was not random. It was structured. It pulsed in perfect synchronization with the rotation of the vortex. Every cycle matched the motion of the storm with exact timing, as if both systems were linked to the same internal process. And then researchers noticed something that shifted the entire discussion. The pulse interval was measured at 9 hours and 55 minutes. That number is not arbitrary. It is the exact rotation period of Jupiter. Take a moment to process that. We are observing a comet, an object with no atmosphere, no internal heat engine, no capacity for large-scale fluid dynamics, replicating not only the structure and behavior of Jupiter's great red spot, but also its rotational timing down to the minute. Let's quantify the probability. The chance of a comet forming a storm that resembles Jupiter's is already extremely low, estimated at around 0.002%. The chance of that storm independently matching Jupiter's rotational period is effectively zero. The likelihood of both occurring simultaneously on the same object under these conditions is beyond statistical relevance. In over 4 million years of observed comet activity, nothing even remotely similar has ever been recorded. Nature does not duplicate complex systems like this without a mechanism. So the next step was obvious. Scientists needed to test whether an external force could be responsible. One hypothesis was gravitational influence. Could Jupiter itself be inducing this behavior through tidal resonance? Could its massive gravitational field be somehow shaping the comet's activity from a distance? A simulation was run at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. The result was immediate and definitive. At a distance of 4.2 astronomical units, over 600 million kilometers, Jupiter's gravitational effect on 3I Atlas is negligible. There is no measurable interaction strong enough to produce anything close to what we are seeing, which leaves us with two possibilities. The first is that we are witnessing a completely unknown state of matter, a form of gas behaving like a superfluid, capable of maintaining coherent structures in near-vacuum conditions, driven by an internal energy source we do not yet understand. If that is true, it would force a complete rewrite of fluid dynamics. The second possibility is more difficult to accept: that the system is not natural, that the precision, the replication, the synchronization are not accidents, but outcomes of a process designed to mimic something far larger. Because if an object can reproduce the signature of a gas giant, then it can do more than just imitate. It can hide. And what happens next suggests that this is not just a passive imitation, but an active system entering a new phase. Stay with me, because the moment this storm begins to change, the entire situation moves from anomaly to signal. See, Part 4 is approximately equal to 600 words. At this point, the evidence had already crossed the threshold from unusual to unexplainable. We had a comet behaving like a planet, a storm system forming where no atmosphere exists, and numbers that refuse to align with any known model. But what happened next is what forced agencies to stop treating this as a scientific curiosity and start treating it as an event. Because the storm did not remain static, everything we've discussed so far, the impossible Reynolds number, the perfect geometric ratios, the synchronized thermal gradients, was documented and verified within a 2-4-hour window. Under normal conditions, even the most stable vortex would eventually decay. Energy dissipates, structures collapse, entropy wins. But that is not what happened here. On February 17, 2026, at exactly 1442 UTC, the NASA Deep Space Network detected something new. Something that had not appeared in any previous observation of this object. The storm began to emit a signal. Not background radiation. Not random electromagnetic noise. A focused, narrowband transmission, high intensity, highly structured, and locked to a specific frequency. 22,2 GHz. That number matters. In astrophysics, this frequency corresponds to what is known as the water maser line. Maser emissions are the microwave equivalent of lasers. They occur naturally in space, typically in star-forming regions, and while they can be powerful, they are also chaotic and unstructured. This signal was neither. It was stable. It was directional. And most importantly, it was patterned. The transmission was pulsing in a sequence of prime numbers. R, Sen, Wu, Qi, Shi. Repeated continuously, with a full cycle completing every 43 seconds. Take a moment to think about that. Prime numbers are not a natural outcome of random physical processes. They are mathematical constructs. They represent order, logic, and intention. A natural storm does not count. A plasma vortex does not generate arithmetic sequences. So when this pattern was first detected, the immediate assumption was interference. A ground-based signal. A satellite malfunction. Something terrestrial contaminating the data. But within minutes, that explanation failed. 3 independent observatories confirmed the source. The Green Bank telescope in the United States locked onto the signal. The Effelsberg radio telescope in Germany verified the frequency. The Parkes Observatory in Australia triangulated the origin. All 3 pointed to the same location, the center of the red vortex on 3I Atlas. This was not interference. It was not noise. It was a coherent transmission originating from the storm itself. And then, something even more unexpected happened. As the signal intensified, the storm began to move. Now, on Jupiter, the Great Red Spot drifts slowly across the planet's surface due to atmospheric dynamics and rotational forces. Its motion is gradual and predictable, governed by well-understood physics. But 3I Atlas is not Jupiter. It does not have an atmosphere capable of supporting lateral storm movement. It does not have surface winds that can carry a vortex across a rotating body. And yet, the storm shifted position across the comet's surface in a controlled, measurable way. Not randomly, not erratically, deliberately. The motion was tracked over several hours. The vortex adjusted its position relative to the comet's rotational axis, maintaining its structure while relocating across the surface. This is not something a passive system does. This is not something driven by external forces. This is controlled behavior. At this stage, the discussion inside scientific institutions changed completely. The question was no longer, what is causing this? But what is this trying to do? Because when you combine all the observed elements, a pattern begins to emerge. We have a structure that mimics a known planetary system. We have a rotational period that matches a gas giant. We have a mathematically perfect geometry. And now we have a signal, a deliberate, repeating sequence of prime numbers. Each layer adds complexity. Each layer reduces the probability of a natural explanation. And when you look at all of it together, one possibility becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. This is not random behavior. This is a system executing a sequence. And if that is true, then the movement of the storm is not just a physical adjustment, it is part of a larger process. Because signals are not sent without purpose. And patterns are not created without meaning. Which leads to the most important question so far. If this is a transmission, who is it for? Because what happens next suggests that the signal is not just being broadcast into space, it is being directed. And the moment scientists realized where it was pointing, the situation escalated beyond astronomy into something far more serious. Stay with me, because in the next part, we follow the signal, and where it leads changes everything. By the time the signal was confirmed across multiple observatories, the situation had already crossed into territory no one was prepared for. But what truly changed the direction of this investigation was not the existence of the signal, it was where the signal was going. Because this was not a broadcast in all directions. It was focused. As data from the NASA Deep Space Network continued to stream in, analysts began mapping the beam pattern of the 22.2 GHz transmission. What they found was immediately concerning. The signal was not dispersing like a natural maser emission. It was tightly collimated, like a laser, highly directional, with minimal spread. and when they traced its trajectory, it pointed to a very specific region of space. The inner solar system. More precisely, it intersected Earth's orbital path. Now, at first, that might not sound unusual. Many cosmic signals pass through the solar system, but this one was not random background radiation. It was structured, repeating, and now clearly aimed. That changes everything. Because once you establish direction, you establish intent. The next step was to decode the signal more deeply. Up until this point, the prime number sequence had been the dominant feature. But as researchers increased resolution and extended observation time, they noticed something embedded within the pulses, subtle variations in amplitude and spacing. In other words, the signal was layered. The prime numbers were just the outer shell. Inside that shell was modulation complex, non-random, and consistent across all receiving stations. This wasn't noise. This wasn't interference. It was information. Teams at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory and international partners began running decoding models. Binary interpretation was the first approach, then frequency mapping, then pattern recognition algorithms. Within hours, something began to emerge. The signal wasn't just counting, it was encoding. At this stage, I want you to pause and consider the progression we've observed so far. First, a comet develops a storm system identical to Great Red Spot. Then, that storm stabilizes into perfect geometric proportions. Next, it begins pulsing in sync with Jupiter's rotation period. After that, it emits a prime number sequence. And now, that sequence is carrying additional information. This is not random layering. This is structured escalation. Each phase builds on the previous one. And then came the breakthrough. By isolating the modulation patterns and converting them into binary sequences, researchers identified repeating block segments that were not arbitrary. These segments showed statistical distributions that matched known biological encoding patterns. Specifically, 4 distinct repeating states. If that sounds familiar, it should. Adenine, cytosine, guanine, thymine. The 4 base components of DNA. At this point, the room didn't just go quiet, it stopped, because what the data was suggesting was not just improbable, it was unprecedented. The signal was not only structured mathematically, it was structured biologically. The immediate reaction was skepticism. The possibility of false pattern recognition, seeing meaning where none exists, is always a risk in complex data analysis. So the teams ran control tests. They scrambled the data. They randomized input streams. They removed known biases. The result did not change. The pattern held. Across independent systems, across different decoding methods, across multiple institutions, the same conclusion kept appearing. The signal contained a mapped structure consistent with genetic encoding. Now, let's be very clear about what that means. This is not a vague resemblance. This is not a loose analogy. The signal is organizing itself in a way that mirrors the fundamental structure of biological information. And it is coming from a storm on a comet 200 million kilometers away. At this stage, the conversation inside scientific circles shifted again. This was no longer just about physics. This was about information. Because if a signal contains structured data, and that data corresponds to a known system, in this case, biological encoding, then the probability of it being natural approaches 0. And if it is not natural, then it must be generated. Which leads to the most difficult question yet. If this is a generated signal, what is it trying to communicate? Because signals like this are not accidental, they are constructed, designed, sent with purpose. And when you combine direction, structure, and content, you arrive at a conclusion that cannot be ignored. This transmission is not just passing through our solar system, it is targeting it. And what comes next is what forced agencies to take unprecedented action. Because once the decoding reached a certain threshold, The implications were no longer theoretical, they were immediate. Stay with me, because in the final part,